the AFC North, going through what y'all need to know to make some money on this bitch. So this division not actually changed a whole lot going up to this point in the offseason. Now, obviously, the draft the biggest source of change pretty much every year. But right now, most of these teams look pretty similar. Now, there's stuff upcoming, of course, with the Bengals building around Joe Burrow, the retirement of Big Ben, things like that. But as of now, not a ton to talk about going into the draft. So you see the picks on screen, and let's just get into what these rosters are looking like going into the draft. So first, Baltimore Ravens. And this team is still set up to be really, really, really good. But they do have a couple of holes, especially this top one here, that are concerned for sure. So yeah, you see right at the top there, edge rusher. Right now, all you have on roster, Pernell McPhee, Tyus Bowser, and Jalen Ferguson. I mean, I like McPhee a little bit actually, but really missing players who can rush the passer. Now, Bowser and well, most just I was going to say Ferguson. He's not exactly nothing to write home about, but at least in Tyus Bowser, is what he can play the run well and do some of the stuff that Matt Judon, who left in the offseason, can do. But you're still really, really missing a high-end pass rusher. And I will acknowledge that the Ravens are really good about generating pressure without that. There's a reason they allowed Judon to get as many sacks as he did, and Zadarius Smith before him and guys like that. But it's harder to do, and it's always going to be beneficial to have somebody who can replace that spot. And while they do have interior guys, like Calais Campbell, that's definitely the number one thing. Next, center here. I mean, really, the rest of these are all more marginal things than anything, because you can get away with what they have on the roster. Patrick McCarry, as of right now, I would suspect to be the starting center. Maybe Tristan Colon Castillo, rookie last year at Missouri, who played some games towards the end of the season. You could get away with them. Neither of them are horrible. It's hard to be bad enough at center to tank a team's offense, and neither of them fit that category. But that's definitely a spot you can get better, and it's the number one spot you can get better outside of edge really quickly, even with a rookie. For sure. So that's really going to be looking at wide receiver depth. Now, a lot of people have this as number one on the Ravens. I'm definitely going to fight back on that. While I do think it's neat, hence why it's on this list, there's a ton of truth to the fact that the Ravens just don't rely on wide receivers to run their offense. Lamar Jackson rarely looks outside of the numbers. He doesn't target receivers the way that other quarterbacks do, and that's okay. Obviously, it still works for them, and it will continue to do so. I have very little doubt about that, but they could use, I will admit, like I said, some more talent there. Now, they do bring in Sammy Watkins in the offseason, which I actually think is a bigger deal than most people. I know a lot of Ravens fans, or just people in general, not excited about that, which, I get it from a narrative perspective, but listen, Sammy Watkins is really good as a receiver. He's very skilled. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's going to be really helpful to this team, 100%. He's just a significantly better version of what Willie Snead gave them, which was valuable despite not putting up huge, fantasy numbers. But I can see on the outside, yeah, they do need some more help, and other guys like Marquise Brown hasn't worked out. He's just a kind of meh receiver, very similar to like Christian Kirk in that regard. They're just not that good. But well, I don't think it's a huge number one need. It's not going to define if they can be successful on offense next year. It is something they can afford to bring in for sure. Next thing, secondary depth. This is something I think has been underrated a little bit with the Ravens, is they've lost a lot of the bedrock that their really, really good defense was built on. Now, the top is still there. If they stay healthy, this isn't even a concern. But if they don't, you lose some guys in the offseason and over the last couple of years just in general, that would have me concerned about who they would bring in to replace Marcus Peters, Jimmy Smith, Marlon Humphrey. And you can definitely find that later in the draft. Now, are they guaranteed to be good? No, but that's a place you're going to be taking shots on. And last, linebacker, again, this is kind of similar to center. 100% you can get away with what they have on the roster. Patrick Queen, I didn't love him as a rookie, but he's definitely, he's a clear-cut starter, and I think he can do some things really well. I'd be excited about him going forward. And other than him, LJ Fort, you're more than fine with. They draft Malik Harrison, CJ Board. They have guys there for sure. But again, with the draft, it's about what spots can they get better at without going above and beyond what is maybe allowed in the draft. And these are the spots for them. So Baltimore Ravens, not a ton to look for outside of that first one, but still looking at a really good team here. And then we got the Cincinnati Bengals. Definitely a team I have a whole lot of thoughts about. Now, this is a team, especially on the defensive side, that has some really strong position groups. But this is also a team with some really, really horrible ones throughout the rest of the team, and I'm not exactly encouraged for their prospects this year. They still have a lot of holes to fix, and that's what I'm going to go through. But, first one now, and people are going to argue with this because obviously the first thing you probably notice is that offensive line isn't the top one. And the reason for that, really, is because what they have on the offensive line actually, as of now, constructed healthy, is not horrible. It's really not. And now, it's not great. Is it like top 10 in the NFL? No. Can they get better at that? Obviously, all the spots are still on this list pretty high. But the reason it's not number one is because the number one spot, linebacker, and we'll talk about the offensive line stuff later, they do not have NFL starters at like even marginal ones. Now, people are going to argue, well, they just drafted Logan Wilson and Nakeem Davis-Gaither last year. Just because you draft players doesn't mean you drafted good players. And just because they're higher draft picks, again, doesn't mean they're good. Logan Wilson, Davis-Gaither, neither of them showed me anything that was encouraging as far as a actual NFL starter goes next year. And if you're in that bad of a spot, then really it can torpedo your defense, especially defense, I think, has a chance to be pretty good given the talent around them. But that one spot might be bad enough as constructed to really tank everything else for sure. So that's why that's number one. That's what it was now. The offensive line, still definitely a problem. You have some guys, bring in Riley Reif, who's going to be a average to above average starter, pretty much guaranteed. Last year, they pick up Quentin Spain later in the year. They now have him, who I think was pretty underrated. He was the Bill at the time of his release was probably the Bills' second best offensive lineman. It was pretty kind of released inexplicably, but he's going to be a decent starter between Xavier Suafilo, Alex Redmond, who played a little bit in the middle of last year. You have guys at guard at the other spot who can at least function. Center is an issue. That's why it's number two. Trey Hopkins, not good. Really, really not good. But as I mentioned in the Ravens segment, centers just, it's hard to be bad enough to make your offense suck. And Trey Hopkins is close to that barrier, but he's not there. There is really no starting center at this point in the NFL that is at that point. So, yeah. And the other thing, next, tackle. People are going to ask why that's above guard. That's the reason I mentioned they actually have guys I'm pretty confident about as NFL starters at guard, whereas at tackle, Jonah Williams, not good. And his snaps, as far as being an NFL player, really, really been not good, which really disappointed me because, before I got into this, when people talk about him, they talk about him as this can't-miss tackle prospect, someone you know is going to be at least decent, but that's just not the case. If you actually watched him, he loses constantly, really, and he loses bad, too. I mean, he will get beat really quickly up the line of scrimmage at times. He struggles, and you can try to blame it on the rest of the offensive line, but I would much more blame the other offensive lineman struggles on him at a lot of times. He really has not been very good. Could he be better? Sure. He was coming off an injury and all that stuff, but I really think, you could do it with an upgraded tackle already at that spot. And Riley Reif older too, he's on a 1-year deal. So they need help there for sure. Next, wide receiver, another big hole. You got a high-end guy in T. Higgins. Definitely confident in that. Tyler Boyd, he's as far as slot receivers go, he's in the upper half, sure, and that's going to sound harsh. I'm sure a lot of people are going to try to fight back on that. But listen, the guy just doesn't create separation very well. And as far as an offensive driver without positives around him, he's not good. He's really not. Now, is he better than other receivers? In the NFL, sure. That's why I said top half. That's not a huge I don't think he doesn't belong in the NFL or anything. But as an offensive engine or driver of production, he's really, really far behind other guys that actually do that type of thing. So wide receiver, big need. Because other than that, Auden Tate, a pure possession guy. Mike Thomas, I actually think he's a little bit okay. But you just have no one that is going to benefit Joe Burrow. You have guys that aren't going to kill him, right? But you're going to have no one that's creating yards for him. And that's where this wide receiver need comes in. We talked about guard next there. The next one, edge. You're getting definitely into the second tier needs on this team, but another one that's still there. They signed Trey Hendrickson to a ridiculous contract this offseason to presumably be their number one edge. He's not going to be. He's nowhere near good enough. He is not a bad player, and he can do some things, even as a pass rusher, that are definitely useful, but he's not a guy who's going to generate even consistent pass rush. He's just kind of marginal. He's a decent run defender, but he's not dominant, and he's not a guy who's going to drive the pass rush on your team. And past him, as far as edges go, there's nothing. Sam Hubbard, I actually think, is a little bit okay, but he's a really similar player, to be honest with you, with a little less pass rushing strength. But other than, you get past that, you got Khalid Kareem, a basically run defender only. You got I guess Amani Bledsoe, who shouldn't really be playing in your rotation, to be honest with you, doesn't do anything. That's a big one too, because we're at 6 on this list, and we're still talking about needs that are borderline preventative of being a really good team if they don't fix them. Next, though, then we're past that stuff. Tight end, they don't have a starting caliber guy, really. CJ Uzama, you're going to be fine with, but no one who adds positives to your team, which kind of the problem with this whole roster. And safety depth, they just, they have two good guys in Von Bell and Jesse Bates, and then no one else. So, yeah, the Bengals, I mean, they have a strong interior defensive line. They have pretty decent corners. And, Joe Burrow, I'm not crazy about, but I think he's definitely decent. But past that, this roster is just pretty far away from struggling, and they have a lot of holes in places that in the modern NFL you really don't want to have holes at. And then we got the Cleveland Browns. And this is a team I was big on going into last year. Obviously, that ended up being the case. And frankly, I'm going to be even bigger on this year. This is a really, really, really good team. And these draft needs, outside of this first one with the recent release of Sheldon Richardson, which was questionable to say the least, are all kind of none of them are huge. None of them are urgent. None of them are gigantic things that are preventive success, as opposed to what I talked about in the Bengals. This team really similar to the Ravens in a ton of ways, and another team that's set up to be really good. But yeah, so for what they're still missing on the roster here, number one, by far, defensive tackle. They released Sheldon Richardson, so now you're literally on roster only talking about Malik Jackson, Jordan Elliott, and Sheldon Day, which is not enough. Those players I like, especially Malik Jackson, who still has it at this age, and Jordan Elliott, who showed some things to be a useful player beyond a shadow of doubt really last year. But you don't have high-end stuff. You don't have a nose tackle to speak of at all. In terms of anyone who can control the line of scrimmage against the run, and you're just really thin in that spot. Now, that's not a horrible thing, right? Of all the positions you can fix, that's quickly, like with a rookie or with a cheap free agent, that's maybe number one, which is why, again, I think the Browns would be really good. But that's definitely a thing here, is they do need defensive tackles. Next, corner. So this is another one. I said the defensive tackle by far. Maybe I was a little harsh. This corner thing is a need as well. We'll see what they have in Greedy Williams. That's a big question mark here. A player who a lot of people like coming out of college has just effectively never been on the field. They have a true number one in Denzel Ward, though. They have a really, really good slot corner in Troy Hill, who in two corner packages can play on the outside. And that's why this cornerback two need here isn't quite as big as the first one. Now, can they get better there? 100%. They lose two good players in Terrence Mitchell and Kevin Johnson in the offseason, who performed much better in their contracts last year. Now, can they find that again? Maybe. I'm assuming they're going to draft somebody in this spot. But, yeah, definitely something to get better at. Next, rotational rusher. They do sign Jadeveon Clowney, who is not really going to help as a pass rusher. Is a really good run defender, and I do overall like the signing for this team. But they do still need edge rushers. And while they're going to get more interior pass rush with those two guys I mentioned earlier than most teams are, you can never have enough. And while Myles Garrett is very, very elite, you do need actual help past him. And maybe, they have that Tag McKinley they signed, who actually I do think is flashing things as a pure speed rusher for sure, but a place you want to add competition at. Linebacker 3, they signed Anthony Walker, really like that from the Colts. He's going to be good for them. They still have Malcolm Smith. He's good. Past that, though, whether it's Jacob Phillips or Mac Wilson, two younger players that I'm sure they're going to have competing in the 3 spot, that could be an issue for sure. You also have Sione Takitaki on the roster you do not want playing. So definitely a spot there. And the last thing really is wide receiver. You have really good players at the top, and Odell coming off of his injury, Jarvis Landry, you have Rashard Higgins, Kathir Hodge even, and Donovan Peoples-Jones, two players that I thought showed some things that they can get on a field for sure. But just if there's anywhere, especially given the contract situations around these players, the age of the top two, you could add. But the Browns overall, super strong roster still going into this next year. And then much more difficult conversation here compared to the last one, much closer to the Bengals, is the Pittsburgh Steelers, a team that's been really good for a long time, a lot of roster talent that has dried up in some ways here. Now, they do still have strengths on this roster, of course. They still have a chance to be pretty good this upcoming year, but a team that is really missing things. And frankly, this number one need here is the biggest need in this whole division. They just don't have anyone who can play left tackle on their whole roster. You have two tackles just under contract who have any experience with Chuma Okorafor, and or Chukwuma Okorafor, and Zach Banner. Zach Banner being the player who was slotted to be the right tackle last year before having a horrible leg injury. I believe it's week 1. Yeah, definitely was week. I think it was like the first snap of the season actually. And maybe can you move Okorafor to left tackle and Banner to right? Yes, but that is, I mean, those are gigantic question marks. And if they don't work out, then you have literally nothing else. So very clearly number 1 here. The next one, too, is a huge deal. Center. It's just the reason it's second and a less important position, but it's another spot where you have just nothing. You have BJ Finney, who should not be playing, JP Hassenauer, who very clearly showed he should not be playing when he came in for the Pouncey brother at the end of last year. And that's another spot that they might be, I talked about the Bengals. They might, as of now, be close enough to that spot where being so bad there torpedoes the rest of their offense. Now, easier to get better there, yeah, for sure. So clearly they need offensive line help. Otherwise, they are not going to be good. But I'm sure they know that. Next thing, corner 2. Now, maybe they have that on the roster. And that's something with pretty much all the rest of these things, these needs outside of quarterback. They're in a position where they might have the player that they need on roster already. He just hasn't played snaps yet, so I can't say that. But, corner 2, they have Joe Hayden, still good number 1. Cam Sutton showed he can play in the slot last year. But other than that, basically it's just Justin Lane, who was fairly highly drafted out of Michigan State a couple of years ago. I believe third rounder, and has been on the field a little bit. I never thought he was too bad, to be honest. I didn't think he was great either, but is he going to hold up as a corner 2 over the course of a season? I just don't know. He's not bad enough for me to say I doubt it or, absolutely not, as opposed to some other teams have. But I'm not convinced, and that's definitely a spot you could be looking for to at least add competition. Same thing, really, with edge. Here it's just a little bit less important, and with a player I'm a little bit more sure about, because obviously you have TJ Watt, super elite on one end, but the other side and Steelers fans kind of are fighting back on this being a need, which I don't understand, because they definitely should know how valuable it is to have 2 really good edge rushers, and what happens when you don't. Look at what the Steelers' defense was towards the back end of last year. Because, right now, past Watt, you just have Alex Highsmith, who did perform decently as a rookie. And I'm fine with him as like a starter playing early down snaps, but you really are missing pass rusher and you're really missing depth, because if anything happens to him, or if anything happens to Watt, you're completely screwed if you're the Steelers here. And they do, similar to the Ravens, do a very good job of generating pass rush without elite players, yes. And they do have pass rush from the interior. I get all that. But if you want your team to be good, you need this defense to be good. If this defense to be good, they have to have a borderline dominant pass rush, which if your only other edge is Alex Highsmith, you're not going to get. So definitely a big need here. Next one, quarterback. This, I think I said this would be the only one. Or earlier I said I would only have one team with quarterback, and if it was a need, not at number 1. This would be the other one. And that's just because they can still be really good this year, and they do have a quarterback who can perform this year in Ben Roethlisberger, but past that they have nothing. Dwayne Haskins, very comfortable promising, similar to Sam Darnold, that he will not be the guy, and obviously not Mason Rudolph. So they do need a quarterback, but they have a chance to be good this year, which means the quarterback need, right, you can argue pushing in the future to have a chance to be good this year. Next, this stuff, all kind of just little tiny stuff. Tight end 2, lose Vance McDonald, that he played a ton. Eric Ebron, not elite number 1 anyway, but really nothing behind him at this moment. Strong safety, Terrell Edmonds, not a huge fan of him. I don't think he's quite as bad as a lot of people, just because when he was drafted in the first round, everybody was kind of shocked and said he shouldn't have been a first-round pick, which is the case, but he's not, unplayable. He's just not really a difference maker. And then inside linebacker depth, they do sign in the last couple of days, re-signed Vince Williams. At his age, though, and in the modern NFL, I'm not convinced that's going to fix it. In fact, I'd probably bet against it. But they do have, the top end, Deion Bush for sure, and Robert Spillane, who proved to be very good last year. But past that, that's where they can use some help too. So, Steelers, huge holes at the top, though, I got to say. And, it's the AFC North.